I think we're ready to start this third panel of a conference. Originally, we had 3 people in the panel, but I regret to say that we're going to miss Marta Bernabeu's paper because she had a recent family loss, and well, she cannot be with us today, and we truly regret that she's not here and the reasons why she's not with us. And first of all, let me introduce you to Vianna Iorio. She's from Rutgers University. She's a PhD candidate in English at Rutgers University. She studies 19th century British literature and culture with interests in melodrama, adaptation, and women's writing across genres, as well as issues of conventionality, popularity, and spectatorship broadly. Her past projects have included essays on gender expectations in Blanche's The Vampire and on photoplay adaptation of Thackeray's Vanity Fair. She's currently working on an article about TikTok and romance readers and preparing to write a dissertation on Victorian spectacle. And if the two of you agree, Vianna and Elsa, we can leave the questions at the end of the panel, right? And if you do have any problems with the Zoom, just use the chats and we'll try to sort them out, because we happen to have a ghost earlier in the day today. Thank you. The floor is yours, Vianna.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be able to share my work and hear your thoughts today. So I'll be reading from a work in progress from part of my dissertation titled Looking, Among Others, Melodramatic Audiences in the Sensation Novel. Okay. Please excuse my dog if she begins barking. So the affects and sensations of Victorian audienceship were central experiences to 19th century cultural life, and in particular, the experiences of spectatorship manufactured and conventionalized by melodramatic productions, astoundingly popular and enduring across classes and across the century. They became central to other forms of cultural consumption, such as the novel. Today, I will discuss the ways in which Ellen Wood's 1861 sensation novel East Lynne integrates and mobilizes affects of spectatorship, and particularly the spectatorship of women, to model ideal affects of readership. Victorian audienceship was profoundly defined by both effective response and performance of that response, as recently highlighted in work by Jim Davis. So on the one hand, my project is concerned with the genuine vulnerability a woman might feel to look so intensely, to become so completely absorbed in spectacle that awareness and therefore proper regulation of her body is momentarily forgotten. She gasps, she trembles, she swoons. This temporary abandonment of self-regulation, often encouraged particularly by melodrama as a genre, contains all the danger that, say, reading a particularly scandalizing sensation novel might pose to a woman's body. She may come alarmingly close to eroticism. She may crave more and more stimulation. Such feeling in the theater is doubly dangerous, however, because it occurs not in the relative privacy of one's home, even though women's reading in the bedroom provoked its own set of regulatory concerns, but in the always slightly menacing public, where women's presence was questionable in the first place. In the theater, to become absorbed in looking also leaves the body open to be looked at by others, unguarded. On the other hand, both theatrical and novelistic experience in the 19th century were concerned with performance of such spectatorship by women. The performance of these affects were often caught up in the performance of gender. To be properly sensitive to sensation was intrinsic to being properly feminine. Women were expected at theatrical performances to display emotion, like fainting, crying, screaming, and so on. And part of that, and those displays just signaled her as properly sensitive to the spectacle before her. Women spectators throughout the 19th century were far more savvy about their theater-going experience than has been imagined. They were aware of the thrills and excess to expect from the stage, and how to modulate their own behavior in response. To bring oneself to the theater for the express purpose of being taken away by spectacle is not an act without agency, affective awareness, or social implications. Women did not simply drift through the theater door on a breeze. Opening a sensation novel carried a similar social weight. And I argue reading the two together can prove generative. As Tiffany Watts-Smith argues, Victorian audiences were, quote, in turn spellbound and aware of the terms of the contract they had entered into on purchasing a ticket, had gone to the theater to consume their own emotions, paying to watch actors present symbolic near-death experiences so that they might enjoy the pleasure of their own flinches, and in turn, the vicarious relief of crisis averted. Theirs was not a naive encounter with, or an complete enslavement to, the fictional world on the stage. Rather, these audiences consumed their own vivid feelings, in the knowledge that mere simulation of terror had produced them. End quote. The decision to knowingly enter such an emotional contract required of the theater was particularly laden with social implications. To decide to yield oneself to the tide of melodramatic emotion and spectacle might have been a more than welcome release, and possibly a kind of freedom from other social pressures that demanded more strict regulation. Women spectators would have been aware of the particular dynamic of being looked at while looking that was common practice of theaters, especially before auditoria were fully darkened near the close of the century. Watts-Smith argues that it was their knowledge about the effects they produced as performers themselves, in addition to their capacity to negotiate the slippery fictions of the theatrical world and perform alongside them, which marked out out theater audiences as a distinct breed of observers. For Victorian audiences broadly, the theater provided a particular space for performance among other spectators in a constantly monitored and mediated relationship to the action on stage. So now, the novel. The ecosystem of feeling which composed women's spectation in the Victorian theater also characterized women's spectatorship in the novels they read. Scholars have established the ways in which features of melodrama were widely assimilated into the novel across genre and across the 19th century. I expand on this work to explore the ways in which it was not only the generic features of plays themselves, but the experience of attending the theater in its entirety that became built into the experience of novel reading. When women left the theater and picked up a novel, the sensations of spectatorship remained salient, waiting to be invoked again on the page. The novel, of course, could play with feelings of embodiment engendered looking in ways that expanded and reconfigured what could happen on the stage. Ellen Wood's East Lynne was continuously adapted to the stage with great success from the time of its publication in 1861. However, even in novel form, Wood adapts aspects of the stage in a way that pushes at the limits of sensation literature as a genre and the novel as a form. East Lynne integrates melodramatic convention and embodied experience in two major ways. First, the novel draws on what would have been familiar sensations of audience-ship to move the reading experience from one of individual reaction to communal conventionalized response. Second, the novel reconfigures the familiar spectator experience of suspending disbelief of the improbable, buying in, one might say, to, quote, consume their own feelings in order to encourage sympathy for the heroine's fallenness, her sexual fall. The conventions of melodramatic theater makes imagining Isabel's life after her fall possible. She must undergo an improbable accident and undertake a semi-ridiculous plan of posing as a governess to remain in the action of the novel at all, which allows her to experience some kind of reconciliation, however painful, and gives Wood her most direct opportunity to demand sympathy for Isabel. At one of its most emotionally heightened moments, Eastland models a readerly response to sensation fiction dependent on the audience experience of the melodramatic theater. Sir Francis Levison's arrest forms tableau, a phenomenon already well studied across novelistic genres. However, I will focus for a moment on how the audience is also modeled and also arrested in a way that urges readers to feel how they might have felt in the theater with the ritual satisfaction that comes from such an apprehension of a villain. And we know that Sir Francis is a melodramatic villain, not just from his crime, his avarice, and altogether lack of moral conscience, but by the way the onlookers of West Lynne react to him as if they were in a melodramatic audience. At his speeches while running for office, the crowd responds by laughing, hissing, groaning, and applauding, mirroring the common hissing and jeering audiences would perform at such appearance of a villain on stage. At the moment in which Sir Francis is arrested for the willful murder of George Hallijohn, Wood writes that the crowd fell back. The crowd was paralyzed with consternation. The word was passed from one extreme to the other and back again across, and the excitement grew high. A few moments later, as Sir Francis's accomplice, Otway Bethel, is arrested, Wood goes on to write, "You may be sure that the whole assembly was arrested, too, figuratively, and stood with eager gaze and open ears. The crowd freezes in breathless excitement in a mirrored response to the frozen tableau of Sir Francis's arrest before them." Carolyn Williams calls attention to this parallel between stage and spectator as it occurred in the theater, and she writes, "On the melodramatic stage, the tableau interrupts and punctuates the ongoing action with its silent, composed stillness, calling for the audience to be likewise arrested, yet all the while actively feeling and interpreting. In this passage, the crowd is paralyzed, yet also whispering to one another, indulging in rising excitement both in response to the spectacle they are witnessing and the shared experience of witnessing among others. To be so pleasurably paralyzed alongside other bodies in a public, performative, emotionally charged space was a crucial aspect of the embodied experience of melodramatic viewership. There is a vulnerability, a heightened sense of sensation, in this case excitement, that could come from such an implied loss of bodily control in public space, such a giving in, such a performance of heightened sensibility, that readers are encouraged to feel as they read silently or aloud in private spaces. In this moment of Sir Francis's arrest, the narrative also significantly lingers over specifically women's spectatorship and their performance of such spectatorship. The ladies look on from Miss Carlyle's window. Some of them turned pale at the sight of the handcuffs, and Mary Pinner, an excitable girl, screamed, writes Wood. From their vantage point of the window overlooking the square, the women are at once spectators and spectacle. They look on, and they perform the part of the sensitive, excitable girls, and add in turn to the excitement below. The experience of the sensation novel here is intertwined with that of the embodied spectatorship as experienced in melodramatic theaters, collective, performative, and thrillingly paralyzing, especially for women. In addition to this integration of the melodramatic on the level of effective response, Wood also makes use of melodramatic plot and the audience's expectation for and tolerance of the improbable disaster as a means by which to imagine any kind of future for Isabel after she has fallen to Sir Francis. If the novel is not able to imagine her reintegration into society, it is, through her accident and return to East Lynne, at least able to assert a measure of sympathetic redemption. Isabel's near death and subsequent disguise verges on the absurd. She tragically, yet convincingly, conveniently, loses the baby that was the result of her affair with Sir Francis and miraculously survives, yet has her death mistakenly reported. She's in for those who haven't read the novel, she's in a sudden train crash that she magically is able to escape from. Her disguise is garishly ridiculous, involving dramatic disfigurement and near costume-like clothing and accessories of an eccentric governess. The improbability of Isabel's train accident draws our attention to the imaginative work needed just to keep a fallen woman in the plot at all. She is not, for instance, swept away in a biblical flood like Maggie Tulliver's punishment for much less severe crimes, sent to a madhouse like Lady Audley, or exercised to death in the colonies as Hetty Sorrel is in Adam Bede. Indeed, Wood's absurd lengths to even get Isabel within the vicinity of her ex-husband and children, even for a brief time before her eventual death, draws our attention to the rigidity, the insurmountability of social stigma that only the wildly melodramatic can overcome. Wood uses this improbability and the impossibility of Isabel's later actions to question such social judgment. In rare moments of a direct address to the reader, she writes, "She brought it upon herself. She ought not have come back to East Lynne," groans our moralist again. Don't I say so? Of course she ought not. Neither ought she have suffered her thoughts to stray in the manner they did towards Mr. Carlyle. She ought not, but she did. If we all did just what we ought, this lower world would be worth living in. You must just sit down and abuse her, and so cool your anger. I agree with you that she ought never to have come back, that it was an act little short of madness, but are you quite sure that you would not have done the same under the facility and the temptation? Here, Wood defends her character's actions, but also implicitly her own choices as an author. Isabel ought not to have gone back to East Lynne, and some readers may think Wood ought not to have contrived to bring her by such means bring her there. This address, as measured as it may seem to readers now, was certainly read as encouraging a dangerous amount of sympathy with a fallen woman such as Isabel. Everything after, "Of course she ought not," was cut from the sanitized single-volume edition commonly reprinted throughout the 20th century. This moment is only made possible through Wood's integration of melodramatic audience convention and expectation. Thank you all.